you have never experienced the world without it. Consciousness. The most familiar thing you've ever known, yet the most mysterious. It's the whisper behind every thought, the stage for every memory, the canvas for every emotion. Every sound you've heard, every dream you've drifted through, every fear, every love, every fleeting intuition, filtered through its invisible lens. And yet, we don't know what it is. We can scan brains, measure reactions, map behaviors, down to synapse and cell. We can watch neurons fire as a face is recognized, a name is recalled, a song stirs tears. But none of this tells us why it should feel like anything at all. Why does a symphony stir the soul? Why does red feel different from blue? Why do we feel pain or joy or wonder instead of being silent machines? Philosophers have wrestled with this for millennia, trying to trace the line between matter and mind. Is consciousness something the brain does, or something that is? Is it a trick of complexity, or a fundamental feature of the universe, like space and time? Some say it emerges from networks of neurons, billions of sparks creating the illusion of self. Others suggest it's not the byproduct of brains at all, but the ground of all being, the very fabric from which reality is woven. Some argue only humans possess it, our language, our culture, our self-awareness setting us apart. Others believe it flickers in every living thing, in the startled retreat of a snail, the pulse of a forest, the quiet stillness of a cat watching the rain, and maybe, just maybe, it exists beyond life entirely. Despite centuries of thought and decades of science, consciousness remains a riddle wrapped inside our own experience. It is the light by which we see the world, but it cannot illuminate itself. It is with us in every waking moment, yet when we look for it directly, it slips through our grasp like smoke. We study it, define it, debate it, but consciousness is not just a puzzle to be solved. It is the lens through which all puzzles are seen. We cannot step outside it to observe it objectively, because we are it. It is the silence behind thought, the presence behind personality, the eye behind the eyes. We may build machines that mimic thought. We may simulate intelligence. But can we ever recreate the feeling of being, the warmth of sunlight on skin, the ache of loss, the joy of a private joke? To ask what consciousness is to question what you are and what you even means. In this journey, we will not find all the answers, but we will explore the questions that make us human. We'll walk the edge between science and spirit, thought and mystery, from brain scans to Buddhist koans, from artificial minds to altered states. This is the story of the most intimate mystery we know. So take a breath, let go of what you think you know, and step with me into the unknown. This is the story of consciousness, the most familiar stranger. Let's begin. What is consciousness? It sounds like a question a child might ask. So simple, so obvious. But behind those three words lies a mystery that has eluded the sharpest minds for millennia. Despite centuries of philosophy, decades of neuroscience, and lifetimes of introspection, we still don't have a clear answer. You are conscious. You know what it feels like to be you. You hear music, you see color, you feel warmth, cold, hunger, joy, sadness. You don't just detect these things. You experience them. There's a world inside your mind, as vivid and present as the world outside. But what is that experience made of? Why does it feel like anything at all to be alive, to think, to feel, to dream? That question, deceptively simple, infinitely complex, has haunted thinkers in every culture and era. Today, it has a name: the hard problem of consciousness. Most of science explains behavior. Why does a rock fall when dropped? Gravity. Why does a flower turn toward the sun? Phototropism. Why does a person flinch at a loud noise? Neural pathways and reflex arcs. But consciousness isn't a behavior. It's a quality of being. It's not what something does, but what something is like from the inside. There's a profound difference between explaining what something does and explaining what something feels like. This is the strange heart of consciousness. If I build a robot that winces when you poke it, has it felt pain? If a machine says I'm scared, is it afraid? Or is it just mimicking the behavior, empty on the inside? Of course, we don't think rocks are conscious, or thermostats, or plants. But what about bees, octopuses, dolphins, dogs? And what about machines that pass the Turing test? AI models that seem to understand, respond, maybe even suffer. To even begin to answer, we have to define consciousness. And here, we hit a wall. Every definition of consciousness seems to loop back on itself. Say it's awareness. Well, then what is awareness? Say it's subjective experience. Then we need to define what subjective and experience really mean. It's like trying to describe taste to someone who's never eaten, or red to someone born blind. Philosopher Thomas Nagel offered a deceptively simple question. What is it like to be a bat? Not how a bat moves or eats or navigates using sonar, but what it feels like to be that bat, to sense the world through sound, to fly, to hang upside down. That question opens a chasm in our understanding. We can study bat behavior, bat brains, bat biology, but that inner world, that's beyond our reach. And yet, we know it exists, because we live in an inner world too. Not all consciousness is the same. Philosophers and scientists have identified different layers or flavors of the conscious experience. Phenomenal consciousness, the raw, immediate experience of being, the sting of pain, the sweetness of mango, the warmth of sun on your skin. This is sometimes called qualia, the what it's like of a moment. Access consciousness. When your experiences are available to your thinking brain, you can reflect, talk about them, act on them. For example, you might see something in the corner of your vision, but not consciously notice it until your attention shifts. Self-consciousness, the awareness of yourself as a separate being, the recognition that you are the one having these experiences, that voice in your head that says, I am me. These layers don't always align. You can have phenomenal experiences, like in dreams, without access or self-awareness. You can have self-awareness in the mirror, but miss what's happening in your blind spot. Understanding these layers is crucial. It shows that consciousness is not a single thing, it's a constellation. This brings us to one of the biggest divides in modern thought. Is consciousness a fundamental property of the universe, or just a byproduct of complex systems like the brain? Some scientists and philosophers believe consciousness is emergent, that it arises when matter organizes itself in a sufficiently complex way. Just as water emerges from hydrogen and oxygen, consciousness emerges from neurons and networks. It's not in the atoms, it's in the arrangement. Others argue that consciousness is fundamental, a basic building block of reality, like space, time, or mass. This idea, called panpsychism, suggests that all matter might have some degree of consciousness, even if it's unimaginably faint. It sounds wild, but it's not new. Ancient Hindu philosophy describes Brahman, consciousness as the ground of all being. Buddhism speaks of mind as nature. In the West, philosophers from Leibniz to Whitehead have imagined some form of proto-consciousness in all things. Is a single neuron conscious? What about a network of neurons, a brain, a planet? We don't know. But the question may force us to rethink what we mean by matter itself. Is consciousness something you either have or don't, like a light switch? Or is it a spectrum, rising gradually from simple organisms to complex ones? This matters when we ask questions like, when does a fetus become conscious? Do fish feel pain? Can AI be aware? What rights should be granted to animals or machines? Even in humans, consciousness isn't all or nothing. Think about dreamless sleep, where your consciousness seems to vanish, anesthesia, where you lose time entirely and return hours later with no memory, comas, vegetative states, locked-in syndrome cases where awareness may persist without the ability to respond, meditation, where consciousness can become refined, heightened, or even disappear into silence. If consciousness can shift, flicker, deepen, or dissolve, what does that say about what it is? One of the strangest things about consciousness is how it disappears. Go under general anesthesia, and hours pass like a blink. There is no tunnel, no fade out, no sensation. You're simply gone. And then you return, as if nothing happened. The clock says time passed, but to you it didn't, because you weren't there. So what happened to you? Were you somewhere? Was there a gap in your existence? Or was you never a constant thing to begin with? And what about dreams? Dreams are a kind of conscious experience, but disconnected from the world, logic, even identity. Sometimes you're not even you in the dream. Sometimes you don't know you're dreaming. But in a lucid dream, you do. You realize, I'm in a dream right now. That realization, consciousness becoming aware of itself, raises even deeper questions. If you can be unconscious inside consciousness, if you can wake up within a dream, what does that say about waking life? Different traditions have tried to chart the landscape of consciousness. Each map reflects its own metaphors, values, and assumptions. The Upanishads speak of Atman, inner self, and Brahman, the universal spirit. To know one is to know the other. Buddhist philosophy outlines layers of mind, from gross awareness to subtle and non-dual awareness. Taoism sees consciousness not as a thing to grasp, but a flow to align with. Western philosophy offers many mirrors. Descartes' I think, therefore I am, Locke's memory-based self, Kant's structures of perception, William James's stream of consciousness, and today, cognitive science adds new models, global workspace. Theory suggests consciousness arises when information is broadcast across many brain regions. Integrated information theory, IIT, posits that consciousness corresponds to how much and how deeply information is connected within a system. Predictive processing sees the brain as a simulation machine, constantly guessing what's happening and adjusting based on input. These theories offer glimpses, but none explain why any of it feels like anything. In the next chapter, we go deeper. We look directly at the hard problem of consciousness. Why does anything feel like something? And what does it mean if we never find the answer? Why can't science explain subjective experience? We know a lot about the brain, more than ever before. Decades of research in neuroscience have yielded detailed maps of neural circuits, synaptic mechanisms, and the intricate dance of neurotransmitters that shape our thoughts and behaviors. We can measure electrical activity with astonishing precision. We can stimulate parts of the cortex and provoke memories, images, or feelings. We can even scan a brain and predict, with increasing accuracy, what a person is seeing, thinking, or dreaming. And yet, for all this progress, nothing we find explains why any of it should feel like something. You could study every neural firing in someone's brain, map every input, every output, every connection, every spike in voltage or surge of dopamine, but you'd still be left with a question that refuses to go away. Why is there something it is like to be that person? This is the core of what philosopher David Chalmers famously called the hard problem of consciousness. It's not the problem of how the brain processes information or how it controls behavior. Those are the easy problems. Easy not because they're simple, but because we know how to approach them. They're questions of mechanism, of biological engineering. With enough data and ingenuity, they yield answers. But the hard problem is this: why does all that processing lead to an inner world? Why do photons bouncing off objects cause a cascade of biological reactions that somehow result in the experience of color? Why do vibrations in the air become music? Why does the thought of someone you love generate an entire symphony of emotion within your chest? These are not questions about mechanics, they're questions about experience, and that's where things get weird. You can know everything about how a piano works, how the strings vibrate, how the sound travels through air, how the keys trigger hammers, but that won't tell you what it feels like to play your first song, alone at midnight, heart pounding, tears welling in your eyes. Science is incredibly good at explaining functions, mechanisms, cause and effect, but experience isn't a function. It's something else entirely. It's first person, private, subjective. It cannot be weighed or measured, only lived. And subjectivity, by its very nature, resists the cold tools of objectivity. It slips through the cracks of equations and scans and models. This is where many scientists and philosophers split paths. Some argue that eventually we will explain consciousness entirely in terms of brain states and physical processes. That subjective experience is just what certain computations feel like from the inside. This is sometimes called functionalism, the idea that consciousness arises from specific kinds of information processing, regardless of the material substrate. Others say, not so fast. That leap from objective description to subjective feeling remains a gap that no amount of data has ever closed. No matter how intricate the map, the territory of experience remains uncharted. Take the famous case of Mary the color scientist. Mary lives in a black and white room. She has never seen color, but she is the world's leading expert on the science of color vision. She knows every physical fact about wavelengths, retinal cones, neural processing. She's read every paper, run every simulation, mastered every equation. Then, one day, she leaves the room and sees red for the first time. The question is, did Mary learn something new? Most people say yes. She gained a new experience. She learned what red feels like. But if that's true, then it means that there are truths about consciousness that cannot be captured by objective science alone. Experience adds something real, something essential. This again is the hard problem. It's not just that we don't know the answer, it's that the very tools of science may be fundamentally unequipped to answer it. To press the point even further, Chalmers proposed another thought experiment, the philosophical zombie. Imagine a being that's physically identical to a human in every way. It walks, talks, reacts, and even claims to have consciousness. But it has no inner experience, no awareness. It's just a machine. The question is, if it's possible to imagine such a being, functionally identical but experientially empty, then consciousness must be something extra, something beyond just physical processes, something that doesn't show up on the brain scan. Now, not everyone agrees. Many argue that philosophical zombies are incoherent, that consciousness just is what certain brain states feel like, that imagining a zombie is like imagining a square circle. It sounds possible, but it's logically flawed. But even if you reject zombies, the intuition remains. There seems to be something special about subjective experience, something that doesn't reduce neatly to physics or information flow. This leads us into one of the oldest philosophical debates. Is mind separate from matter? Dualists say yes. There is a fundamental distinction between the physical body and the immaterial mind. Descartes was the most famous dualist, claiming, "I think, therefore I am." For him, the mind was a separate substance, a thinking thing, distinct from the extended thing we call the body. Dualism comes in many forms. Some believe in a literal soul. Others see consciousness as an irreducible property, not captured by any known physical law. Dualists argue that subjective experience simply cannot be explained by materialism, no matter how detailed our neuroscience becomes. Physicalists, on the other hand, believe that everything, including consciousness, is ultimately physical. It may be complex, emergent, or poorly understood, but there's nothing fundamentally non-physical about it. Every thought, every feeling, every moment of awareness arises from and depends on the brain. Most modern science leans physicalist. It's the default position in neuroscience and cognitive science, and for good reason. The physicalist view has yielded powerful models, successful therapies, and consistent predictions. But the hard problem keeps the debate alive. Because even if consciousness is physical, we still don't know how. There's still a missing piece, a gap between neurons firing and thoughts arising, a puzzle that no microscope has yet solved. Panpsychism enters the stage. In response to this persistent mystery, an ancient idea has made a surprising comeback. Panpsychism is the view that consciousness is not limited to humans, or even to animals. Instead, it is a fundamental feature of the universe, like mass or charge. Under this view, consciousness is not something that emerges at a certain level of complexity. It is already there, everywhere, in some basic form. Under this view, everything has some degree of subjective experience, even a particle, even a rock. Not a human-like mind, of course, but a glimmer of awareness, a tiny spark. At first, this sounds absurd. Conscious atoms, sentient electrons. But panpsychists argue it may be the only way to bridge the gap between mind and matter. If you start with consciousness as part of the basic fabric, you don't have to explain how it arises from the non-conscious. You only have to explain how it becomes more complex. Some of the most compelling modern proponents of panpsychism include philosopher Galen Strawson and physicist Philip Goff. They argue that materialism has failed to explain consciousness, and dualism raises as many questions as it answers. Panpsychism, they say, is a third way, a bold but coherent proposal. If consciousness is baked into the fabric of reality from the start, then we don't have to explain how it emerges from unconscious stuff. Instead, we only have to explain how simple consciousness combines into complex consciousness, like ours. This idea has gained traction among serious philosophers and even some physicists. It's not science fiction. It's an attempt to take consciousness seriously without hand-waving it away or reducing it to mere illusion. And while panpsychism may not be the final answer, it has reopened the door to a deeper, more radical exploration. What if consciousness is not the exception, but the rule? What if the hard problem is hard, not because it's unsolvable, but because it asks us to rethink everything we thought we knew about reality? Perhaps, in the end, consciousness isn't something to be explained away. Perhaps it's something to be understood on its own terms. Something primary, mysterious, and profoundly real. We've explored the mystery of subjective experience, the so-called hard problem of consciousness. We've asked why neural activity results in a felt inner world, and examined arguments that challenge the adequacy of physicalist explanations. Now, we shift our focus to what we do know, the intimate, intricate relationship between consciousness and the brain. For all the mystery that remains, one thing is clear. Consciousness and the brain are deeply entwined. The question is, how? Let's begin with what we can observe. If you damage specific areas of the brain, consciousness changes. If you disrupt the thalamus or parts of the brainstem, consciousness may vanish entirely. Anesthesia works by altering brain chemistry, leading to a loss of awareness. Psychedelics change patterns of neural connectivity, shifting perception and the sense of self. Even subtle changes in brain activity can profoundly alter conscious experience. Damage to the visual cortex can lead to blindness, not just in vision, but in visual experience. Injury to the fusiform gyrus can erase the ability to recognize faces, even though the eyes still work perfectly. If consciousness was something totally separate from the brain, these patterns would be hard to explain. But instead, we see a consistent story. Alter the brain, and you alter the mind. This empirical tether is the foundation of cognitive neuroscience. The assumption, sometimes explicit, sometimes implicit, is that consciousness arises from neural activity. But this is where things get tricky, because even though we can identify correlates of consciousness, brain activity that occurs when someone is aware, we haven't found a cause. Correlation is not explanation. The lights are on, but we don't know why. Scientists have spent decades searching for what are known as neural correlates of consciousness, or NCCs. These are the specific patterns of brain activity that consistently accompany conscious experience. For example, activity in the posterior cortex, especially in the parietal and occipital lobes, has been strongly associated with visual consciousness. Interestingly, this challenges the assumption that the frontal lobe, often considered the seat of reason and decision-making, is central to consciousness. Patients with damage to the prefrontal cortex often maintain awareness, while damage to posterior regions can obliterate it. Studies using fMRI, EEG, and intracranial electrodes have identified complex feedback loops and synchronous oscillations that seem to play a role in sustaining conscious states. But here's the rub. We still don't know why those patterns create experience. We can say when someone is conscious. We can even predict what they're conscious of. But the how, the mechanism that transforms data into qualia, remains elusive. One of the central puzzles in neuroscience is the binding problem. The brain processes information in specialized regions. Color in one area, motion in another, sound elsewhere. Yet our experience is unified. When we look at a red car driving by, we don't see disconnected patches of color and movement. We see a coherent whole. So how does the brain bind together these separate streams into a single conscious experience? Some researchers propose that synchronous firing across neural populations, a kind of rhythmic coordination, serves to integrate these signals. Others suggest that certain hubs or convergence zones in the brain act as central routers. Still others believe that binding isn't a process at all, but an illusion produced by the way we remember and report experiences. Regardless of the mechanism, the fact remains. Consciousness feels unified, while the brain is massively parallel and modular. This mismatch continues to baffle scientists. Another area of investigation is the relationship between attention and consciousness. Do we become conscious of what we attend to, or can we attend only to what is already conscious? Research suggests that attention is neither necessary nor sufficient for consciousness. You can attend to something without being fully conscious of it, as in priming experiments. And you can be conscious of things you're not directly attending to, like background music. But attention does seem to amplify and stabilize conscious content. In many ways, attention acts like a spotlight. It doesn't create the stage, but it determines what's visible at any given moment. Understanding this interplay is key to building more complete models of conscious processing. Another major discovery in recent decades is the default mode network, a set of brain regions that become active when we're not focused on external tasks, when we're daydreaming, recalling memories, imagining the future, or reflecting on ourselves. The DMN includes areas like the medial prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate cortex, and the angular gyrus. This network is often associated with the sense of self. When the DMN is disrupted, through psychedelics, meditation, or brain injury, people often report a loss of ego boundaries, a feeling of unity with the universe, or the dissolution of the self. These experiences challenge the notion that the self is a fixed, stable entity. Instead, they suggest it may be a construct, a narrative the brain weaves to make sense of internal activity. Understanding the DMN is crucial not just for grasping consciousness, but for addressing mental health. Overactivity in this network is linked to rumination, depression, and anxiety. By studying it, we may uncover new paths to healing, insight, and well-being. This raises a provocative question. Can there be consciousness without a self? Can there be awareness without the I? Some traditions, like Buddhism, say yes. They describe a state of pure awareness, unfiltered, unclaimed by ego. In these states, experience still occurs, but there is no narrator, no boundary, no center. Neuroscience is beginning to take these reports seriously. Brain scans of experienced meditators show decreased activity in the DMN during deep meditative states. This aligns with subjective reports of ego dissolution and non-dual awareness. What's remarkable is that these findings suggest the self is not required for consciousness. It may be an add-on, a useful fiction that organizes experience, but not its source. If true, this would radically shift our understanding of who we are. Another rich domain for exploring consciousness is altered states. Whether through drugs, meditation, trauma, or sleep, the brain can enter radically different modes of operation, and with them, radically different kinds of experience. Psychedelics like LSD, psilocybin, and DMT have been shown to reduce activity in the DMN and increase global connectivity. Subjects report heightened emotion, synesthetic perceptions, ego dissolution, and encounters with seemingly autonomous entities. From a neuroscientific perspective, these states involve increased entropy and brain activity, a loosening of the usual constraints. What's fascinating is that these altered states are not random or chaotic. They often follow archetypal patterns and have profound psychological effects. Some researchers suggest that they offer glimpses into the deeper architecture of the mind, a kind of reverse engineering of consciousness. Sleep and dreaming offer another window. During REM sleep, the brain generates vivid, often surreal experiences, entire worlds constructed without external input. And yet, in deep non-REM sleep, consciousness seems to vanish. Understanding these transitions could reveal much about how and why consciousness arises at all. In an effort to quantify consciousness, some scientists have proposed formal models. One of the most prominent is Integrated Information Theory, IIT, developed by Giulio Tononi. The core idea is that consciousness corresponds to the capacity of a system to integrate information. According to IIT, a conscious system is one that has a high degree of phi, a measure of integrated information. The more a system's parts influence each other in irreducible ways, the higher its consciousness. This theory attempts to bridge the subjective and objective by identifying the physical structures that give rise to experience. IIT has generated both excitement and controversy. It provides a mathematical framework and makes testable predictions, but critics argue that it may be too liberal, suggesting that even simple systems, like logic gates or circuits, have some degree of consciousness. Whether this is a bug or a feature remains debated. Still, IIT represents a bold attempt to tackle the hard problem from within neuroscience itself, using its own tools. Another promising framework is the predictive processing model, which views the brain not as a passive receiver of stimuli, but as an active predictor of the world. In this view, perception is the brain's best guess about what's happening, based on prior beliefs and new sensory input. Consciousness, in this model, emerges when prediction errors become relevant enough to demand attention and update internal models. This can explain phenomena like hallucinations, where the brain's predictions override incoming data, or illusions, where perception deviates from reality in systematic ways. The predictive brain model offers a powerful way to understand both normal and abnormal states of consciousness. It links perception, learning, emotion, and selfhood into a single cohesive framework. What do all these theories have in common? They point to complexity. Consciousness seems to arise not from any single part of the brain, but from the dynamic interplay between many parts. The more richly connected, flexible, and interactive a system is, the more conscious it may be. This suggests that consciousness is not binary, on or off, but graded. There may be many levels, many shades, many flavors of awareness. And perhaps what makes human consciousness special is not that we are uniquely conscious, but that our form of consciousness is unusually elaborate, self-reflective, and temporally extended. We still don't know what consciousness is. We don't know how experience emerges from matter, but we do know that the brain is central to the story. Every thought, every sensation, every emotion seems to pass through its networks. And while we may never find a single consciousness center, we may come to understand the conditions under which consciousness flourishes. Perhaps we're like fish trying to understand water, not because it's hidden, but because it's all we've ever known. Consciousness may be so close, so intimate, that it hides in plain sight. But with each new insight, each new theory, we get a little closer to grasping the thing that lets us grasp anything at all. For centuries, the dominant narrative in neuroscience and psychology has been that the mind is nothing more than an emergent property of the brain, a complex but ultimately reducible phenomenon, born from the synchronized firing of billions of neurons. Within this framework, every thought, emotion, or memory is a direct result of brain activity. The self, the soul, the sense of I am, all just artifacts of grey matter chemistry. But what if that model is incomplete? Scattered across history, cultures, and disciplines, we find stories, testimonies that challenge this assumption. Accounts where consciousness appears to continue despite brain inactivity. Situations where the mind operates in places the body isn't. Experiences that suggest awareness isn't strictly confined to neurons, synapses, and skulls. Are these anomalies, delusions, misinterpretations of stress, trauma, or drugs? Or are they signs that our understanding of consciousness is fundamentally flawed, that we've been peering through the wrong lens all along? Let us examine these phenomena in detail, beginning with one of the most striking and researched anomalies, near-death experiences. Near-death experiences have fascinated and confounded researchers for decades. These episodes occur in moments of extreme physiological crisis, heart attacks, strokes, or traumatic injuries, when a person is clinically dead or on the brink of death. What's remarkable is not just the frequency of these reports, but their striking similarity. Across ages, cultures, and belief systems, people describe eerily consistent features: a sudden detachment from the physical body, a sensation of floating, often accompanied by a panoramic view of their surroundings, a tunnel or corridor, often lit at the end by a radiant, loving light, encounters with deceased loved ones, spiritual entities, or divine presences, a review of their life, often experienced emotionally with a deep sense of moral clarity, a feeling of overwhelming peace, joy, and unity, a decision or command to return to their body. Some of these accounts are vague and symbolic, others are stunningly detailed, and in a growing number of cases, the timing of these experiences coincides with periods of complete clinical death. Flatlined EEGs, no blood flow to the brain, no detectable neural activity. Take the case of Pam Reynolds, often cited as a benchmark NDE case. During a complex brain surgery, doctors induced clinical death, cooling her body, draining her blood, and shutting down brain activity entirely. Despite this, she later reported precise details of the surgical procedure, including instruments used, conversations among the medical staff, and events that occurred while she was under total anesthesia. How could someone with no measurable brain activity have any experience at all, let alone one so vivid and coherent? Skeptics offer naturalistic explanations. Some suggest that these experiences occur as the brain shuts down or reboots during the moments surrounding clinical death. Others point to the effects of neurotransmitters, oxygen deprivation, or cultural expectations. Yet these hypotheses often fail to account for veridical perceptions, cases where patients accurately describe events or objects from outside their line of sight or even outside the room. Such cases, while not common, are deeply compelling. Moreover, the emotional impact of NDEs is profound. People often emerge from these experiences transformed. Their fear of death diminishes. Their values shift. They speak of life with new reverence and urgency. These aren't just hallucinations. They're perceived as realer than real. Could they be glimpses of something beyond biology? Or are we witnessing a final burst of consciousness, a neurochemical epilogue to life's story? The debate rages on. Out-of-body experiences offer another window into the possibility that the mind can operate independently of the brain and body. In an OBE, a person feels as though their consciousness has left their body and is observing it from a detached perspective, often from above. OBEs can occur during sleep, trauma, meditation, or even spontaneously. They're also commonly reported in the early stages of NDEs. While they may seem fantastical, OBEs are surprisingly common. Polls suggest that between 10–20% of people have had at least one such experience. What makes OBEs especially intriguing is the presence of verifiable observations. People claim to see things they should not be able to see. Objects on high shelves, conversations in other rooms, actions taken by doctors while the subject was unconscious. Science has attempted to understand OBEs through various approaches. One notable area of study is the temporoparietal junction, TPJ, a brain region involved in spatial orientation and self-processing. When this area is electrically stimulated, either in epilepsy patients or during surgical procedures, people report sensations of leaving their body or seeing themselves from above. This suggests that our sense of self and its location is a construct of the brain, an internal model of where we are in space. When the model is disrupted, the self can appear to leave the body. But does this explain OBEs entirely, or merely describe the mechanism by which such experiences are perceived? Some argue that the ability to induce OBEs artificially proves they are illusory. Others counter that such stimulation might be opening a door, temporarily allowing consciousness to shift its vantage point. Just because something can be induced doesn't mean it isn't accessing something real. And what about spontaneous OBEs with verifiable data? Some accounts describe accurate information that would have been impossible to gather through normal senses. While such reports remain rare and difficult to validate under laboratory conditions, they continue to push the boundaries of what we believe the mind is capable of. Remote viewing is one of the most controversial examples of purported consciousness extending beyond the brain. The idea is simple yet staggering, that a person can perceive distant or hidden information without using the known senses. In the 1970s, the US intelligence community began funding research into remote viewing under programs like Stargate and Grill Flame. Over 2 decades, researchers and operatives conducted experiments involving individuals who would attempt to describe locations, objects, or events from across the globe, based only on a set of coordinates or a vague prompt. The results? Mixed, but intriguing. In several cases, remote viewers provided information that appeared to be accurate beyond chance. Some of these descriptions helped locate downed aircraft or describe hidden installations. Skeptics argued that the successes were cherry-picked or that the methods were not rigorous. Yet others, scientists and officials alike, emerged convinced that something unusual was occurring. In academic circles, psi phenomena, including telepathy, precognition, and psychokinesis, are generally viewed with skepticism. The failure to produce consistent, replicable results under tightly controlled conditions has led many to dismiss them entirely. Yet, despite this skepticism, psi research continues. Peer-reviewed studies have shown small but statistically significant effects in areas like Ganzfeld experiments, testing telepathy, and presentiment, where physiological responses precede future stimuli. Critics argue these are statistical flukes or artifacts. Proponents insist the effect sizes, while small, are real and meaningful. If even a fraction of these phenomena are genuine, they imply that consciousness has properties that extend beyond time, space, and biology. They suggest a mind that is not just a passive observer within the skull, but a participant in a broader field of information. Of course, the implications are staggering, and the standards of proof must be correspondingly high. But the existence of anomalies, events that defy explanation, should not be grounds for dismissal. They should be a call to investigate more deeply. The idea that consciousness could exist independently of the brain flies in the face of mainstream neuroscience. The scientific consensus is clear. When the brain is damaged, consciousness degrades. When the brain dies, consciousness ends. And there is good reason for this view. Brain injuries cause personality changes. Anesthesia induces unconsciousness. Drugs can alter perception, thought, and memory. Neurological studies show correlations between mental states and neural activity. These facts are undeniable. But correlation is not causation. Just because consciousness correlates with brain activity does not prove the brain produces it. It could be that the brain acts more like a receiver or filter, modulating a consciousness that exists independently, much like a radio tunes to signals already present in the air. Skeptics argue this is unnecessary metaphysics. The burden of proof lies with those making extraordinary claims. And thus far, they argue that proof is lacking. NDEs can be explained as hallucinations. OBEs can be induced by brain stimulation. Remote viewing experiments often fail replication. These are fair critiques. Science must be cautious. It must guard against bias, fraud, and fantasy. But it must also be open. The history of science is filled with paradigm shifts, moments where long-held beliefs were overturned by stubborn data. The Earth is not the center of the universe. Diseases are not caused by imbalance, but by microbes. Continents move. Could consciousness be another such revolution? Whether consciousness can exist beyond the brain remains one of the most profound and unanswered questions in science and philosophy. The evidence is suggestive, but not conclusive. The experiences are powerful, but subjective. The data is intriguing, but inconsistent. And yet, the persistence of these reports, across cultures and contexts, invites us to reconsider our assumptions, not to accept every claim uncritically, but to explore with humility and curiosity. What if the brain is not the source of consciousness, but its instrument? What if awareness is not bound by biology? What if the self is larger than we've been led to believe? These are not merely academic questions. They touch on the core of human identity, meaning, and destiny. If the mind can exist beyond the brain, then perhaps death is not the end. Perhaps consciousness continues in forms we do not yet understand. Or perhaps not. Perhaps these experiences are the mind's final fireworks, a dazzling illusion before the lights go out. But until we know for sure, we must keep asking, keep testing, keep listening to the stories that do not fit. Because in those anomalies, in those edge cases, we may find the seeds of a deeper truth. A truth that says the mind is more than matter, and that consciousness, like light itself, may travel farther than we ever imagined. From the outside, the brain might seem like a closed circuit, neurons firing in predictable patterns, bound by biology, chemistry, and physics. But from the inside, from the intimate, first-person view of consciousness, it's something altogether different. A kaleidoscope of shifting perceptions, strange visions, feelings of infinity, or terrifying nothingness. Altered states of consciousness challenge our assumptions not by defying the brain, but by revealing, what it's truly capable of. They expose the extraordinary elasticity of the mind, stretching the boundaries of identity, time, space, and self. These altered states aren't merely fascinating anomalies or psychological curiosities. They're deeply embedded in the fabric of our experience. In fact, altered states are not otherworldly in the mystical sense. They are intrinsic to who we are. We all pass through them, whether through sleep, dreaming, intense focus, emotion, trauma, or substances. These states are not peripheral to the human experience. They are the human experience. They reveal that consciousness is not static, but dynamic, plastic, and profoundly versatile. Let's begin with the most universal altered state, one we visit almost every night. Every night, whether we remember them or not, our minds slip into dreams. We find ourselves in places we've never seen, having conversations we never planned, acting out dramas we didn't write. Dreaming is so common, so ubiquitous, that it's easy to forget how truly strange it is. In dreams, the rules of logic are suspended. Time stretches and contracts. The impossible becomes mundane. We accept flying, meeting long-lost relatives, changing physical forms, or engaging in illogical behavior without a second thought. Despite the surrealism, emotions in dreams can be more intense than those in waking life. Fear, love, joy, awe, or grief are often amplified and exaggerated. From a neurological standpoint, dreams arise primarily during REM, rapid eye movement sleep, a phase where the brain is highly active even as the body is immobilized. The prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for logical reasoning, decision-making, and self-awareness, is relatively inactive, while more ancient structures like the limbic system, governing emotion, are firing with intensity. This neurological cocktail produces experiences that are emotionally vivid, yet often irrational or non-linear. But something even more extraordinary can happen within dreams. We can become aware that we're dreaming. This is known as lucid dreaming. In this state, the dreamer realizes the nature of their experience and, in many cases, gains the ability to manipulate the dream's content. They can fly, conjure objects or people, teleport, explore their subconscious, or even test philosophical or metaphysical ideas. Lucid dreaming blurs the boundary between dreaming and waking consciousness. It suggests that our conscious self can observe, reflect, and exert agency even within the deep recesses of sleep. This has enormous implications, not only for therapy, creativity, and personal growth, but for understanding the layers and levels of consciousness itself. Some lucid dreamers use the state as a training ground. Athletes practice movements, musicians rehearse, writers explore storylines, and individuals confront fears. The brain, remarkably, responds to imagined scenarios almost as it does to real ones, strengthening neural pathways through visualization. There's also a deeply philosophical dimension. Lucid dreaming invites a fundamental question. If we can awaken within a dream and realize its illusory nature, how can we be certain we aren't dreaming now? What constitutes reality? How do we distinguish between states of awareness? Some mystics and philosophers argue that waking life itself may be just another form of dream, more stable, more consistent, but ultimately constructed by the mind. Dreams, especially lucid ones, open the door to introspection. They reveal that we are not just passive observers of reality, but active participants in constructing our experience of it. While dreams arise spontaneously, meditation and flow states are often cultivated intentionally, and yet the altered states they produce can be just as transformative, and in some cases, even more profound. Meditation, at its core, is the art of focused awareness, whether through breath, mantra, body scans, visualization, or pure observation. Meditation trains the mind to quiet its habitual noise and enter a state of still presence. Over time, meditators report significant shifts in consciousness, a dissolving of the self, the cessation of internal dialogue, the perception of timelessness, and a deep sense of unity with all things. Neurologically, meditation leads to measurable changes in brain function. One of the key systems affected is the default mode network, DMN, a group of brain regions associated with self-referential thinking, daydreaming, and the inner narrator. In experienced meditators, DMN activity is significantly reduced. This quieting correlates with the experience of ego dissolution, the temporary fading of the psychological sense of self. In some traditions, this is considered not an escape from reality, but a return to it. Without the constant narration of the ego, the meditator experiences consciousness without content, pure awareness, untouched by thought or identity. This state has been described as peace beyond understanding, clarity without concepts, and presence without effort. Flow states are a different flavor of altered consciousness, but equally compelling. Coined by psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, flow refers to the optimal state of consciousness, where one feels and performs at their best. It's most often associated with creative and physical activities, painting, climbing, composing music, coding, dancing. In flow, a sense of time warps. Hours may pass in what feels like minutes. The self vanishes, replaced by total absorption in the task. Action and awareness merge into one seamless stream. Like meditation, flow reduces DMN activity and enhances the salience and attention networks. The brain becomes laser-focused, pruning away irrelevant stimuli and unnecessary thought. The result is not just efficiency, but ecstasy, a euphoric, immersive sense of being fully alive. What's striking is that both meditation and flow reveal the same truth, that the ordinary waking mind, the one that plans, worries, compares, and replays, is not the only or even the dominant form of consciousness. Just beneath the surface lies a range of states far more expansive, silent, and potent. These states challenge our assumptions about what consciousness is. They suggest that clarity, unity, and joy are not things we must seek externally. They are inherent potentials of the mind itself, and perhaps more radically, they suggest that our sense of self may be little more than a mental habit, one that can loosen, dissolve, or even vanish under the right conditions. If so, what lies beyond the self? What does it mean to experience without an experiencer? To perceive without an identity? These are not just philosophical questions, they are experiential ones, answered only through the direct exploration of altered states. Psychedelics have been used for thousands of years, across cultures and continents, not just as tools for healing or escape, but as gateways to other realms of consciousness. From ancient shamanic rituals to modern neuroscience labs, these substances continue to provoke awe, curiosity, and controversy. Psychedelics such as psilocybin, found in magic mushrooms, LSD, DMT, dimethyltryptamine, and ayahuasca don't just change what we perceive, they transform the very structure of perception. Users often report vibrant visual hallucinations, synesthesia, the blending of senses, altered time perception, and experiences of unity with all existence. More deeply, they describe encounters with otherworldly beings, the dissolving of the ego, and even glimpses of death and rebirth. Unlike other drugs that dull or numb the mind, psychedelics seem to open it up. Brain imaging studies have shown that under the influence of psychedelics, the brain enters a highly entropic state, meaning it becomes more globally interconnected, less modular, and more fluid. The default mode network, once again, is drastically reduced in activity. The narrative self vanishes, and in its place, a boundless, often ineffable awareness emerges. This temporary suppression of ego, known as ego death, is perhaps the most striking aspect of the psychedelic experience. In ego death, the user no longer identifies with their name, body, memories, or personal history. What remains is pure consciousness, sometimes described as a white light, a cosmic void, or a unified field of awareness. For some, this is terrifying, a brush with the dissolution of everything they've ever known. For others, it's the most liberating experience imaginable, a direct encounter with the divine, the infinite, or the true nature of reality. Research into psychedelics is undergoing a renaissance. Clinical trials suggest that psilocybin can dramatically reduce depression, anxiety, addiction, and PTSD, sometimes after just a single session. But beyond therapeutic potential, psychedelics raise profound philosophical questions. Are these states simply hallucinations, or are they revealing hidden aspects of consciousness? Is the brain generating these visions, or tuning into something greater? The truth remains elusive. What is clear is that psychedelics provide a powerful lens through which to examine the nature of mind, identity, and reality itself. And in doing so, they reveal a startling truth. Consciousness is not a fixed light, but a spectrum. Radiant, vast, and still largely unexplored. Perhaps the most profound alteration of consciousness occurs when the ego, the sense of being a separate, bounded self, dissolves entirely. This phenomenon, often triggered by high doses of psychedelics or deep meditative absorption, is known as ego death. It is not the death of the body, but the temporary death of identity, language, and self-referential thought. In ego death, the boundaries between subject and object collapse. The usual mental distinctions, me versus you, thought versus world, vanish. What remains is raw awareness, unfiltered, unbounded, often infinite. Time may dissolve, space may lose meaning. Some describe it as merging with the cosmos, returning to the source, or realizing that the self never existed in the first place. This can be deeply disorienting. Without a self, who is there to experience? Without thoughts, how can meaning arise? Yet, paradoxically, ego death is often reported as the most meaningful experience of a person's life. It is seen not as annihilation, but as liberation, from illusion, from suffering, from separation. And then, something else happens. The ego returns, but it may return changed. What follows, ego death, is often described as a kind of rebirth. The individual re-emerges from the experience with a transformed perspective, more connected, more compassionate, more aware. The small self that once dominated the stage now feels less central. In its place is a deeper trust in the mystery of being, and a quieter sense of belonging in the universe. This process of ego death and rebirth isn't exclusive to psychedelics. It's mirrored in ancient spiritual traditions, rites of passage, and intense psychological breakthroughs. It appears again and again in myths and religions. The death of the hero, the descent into the underworld, the resurrection into new life. In the end, altered states of consciousness reveal that we are not what we think we are. Beneath the stories we tell ourselves about our identity, our past, our control, lies something more fluid, more mysterious, and perhaps more real. And perhaps that is the ultimate lesson of altered states, that consciousness is not a fixed possession, but a frontier. And the more deeply we explore it, the more we discover that the mind is not just in the brain, and the self is not just a name. Throughout history, humans have tried to make sense of consciousness, not just what it feels like, but what it is. Is it something created by the brain, or is the brain merely a receiver? Is consciousness the byproduct of biology, or the ground of being itself? Theories have emerged from philosophy, science, spirituality, and the in-between spaces where these disciplines collide. Some are rooted in mysticism, others rely on equations, but all of them attempt to solve the same riddle. Why is there something it is like to be? In Western traditions, especially since the Enlightenment, consciousness has often been seen as a function of the mind, which in turn is a product of the brain. Thinkers like Descartes, Locke, and Kant wrestled with the nature of the self and experience, often placing rationality and individuality at the center. In this view, consciousness is private, internal, and shaped by cognition. By contrast, many Eastern philosophies approach consciousness not as a personal possession, but as a universal substrate. In Advaita Vedanta, a non-dualistic school of Hindu philosophy, consciousness is Brahman, the ultimate, formless reality. The apparent world, including the self, is Maya, or illusion. Similarly, in Buddhism, consciousness is seen as ever-changing, devoid of a fixed self. The goal is not to understand or perfect the ego, but to dissolve it. These perspectives aren't just poetic, they challenge deeply held Western assumptions. If the self is an illusion, what exactly is experiencing? If consciousness is universal, not individual, then perhaps the brain is not generating it, but tuning into it. This brings us to modern theories, which attempt to ground these questions in empirical science, without, ideally, losing their depth. Integrated information theory, developed by neuroscientist Giulio Tononi, starts with a radical premise. Consciousness is what it feels like for a system to integrate information. In other words, any system that has a high degree of both differentiation, many distinct states, and integration, those states being interconnected, can be said to have consciousness. IIT attempts to quantify consciousness through a value called phi. The higher the phi, the greater the level of consciousness. A simple thermostat might have virtually no phi. A human brain, with its billions of interlinked neurons, has an extremely high phi. The core idea is that consciousness is not merely about information processing, but about the structure and interdependence of that information. One of the most provocative aspects of IIT is that it's not limited to biological brains. In theory, any sufficiently integrated system, biological or artificial, could possess some level of consciousness. This opens up a philosophical Pandora's box. Could a sufficiently complex AI be conscious? Could a network, or even a nation, have a form of collective awareness? IIT has its critics. Some argue it's too abstract, or that phi is too difficult to measure meaningfully. Others question whether the theory conflates correlation with causation. Still, it remains one of the most serious attempts to bridge subjective experience with physical processes, and to explain why consciousness might be more widespread than we once assumed. Orchestrated objective reduction, or is perhaps one of the most controversial and ambitious theories of consciousness. Developed by theoretical physicist Roger Penrose and anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff, it proposes that consciousness arises not from classical brain processes, but from quantum activity occurring within the neurons themselves, specifically within structures called microtubules. The theory begins with Penrose's idea that certain kinds of quantum processes, called objective reductions, may play a key role in bridging the gap between physical matter and subjective experience. These quantum events are believed to be non-deterministic, meaning they introduce true unpredictability into the universe. Hameroff expanded on this by identifying microtubules, structural components of the cell's cytoskeleton, as possible sites where these quantum effects could be happening inside the brain. In Orshaw, consciousness is not just a passive observer of brain activity, it's the result of orchestrated quantum state reductions occurring across the brain's neural network. These reductions are said to collapse wave functions in a way that produces unified conscious moments. According to Penrose and Hameroff, these events happen on incredibly short timescales, but when synchronized across many neurons, they generate the flow of conscious awareness. Critics of Orshaw argue that the brain is too warm and noisy for delicate quantum effects to survive. Quantum coherence, they say, is more likely in ultra-cold systems like those used in quantum computing, not in a living, wet brain. However, emerging evidence from quantum biology such as quantum effects in photosynthesis and bird navigation, has reopened the debate. Supporters of All-Shore find its implications profound. If consciousness is tied to quantum processes, then it might be fundamental to the universe, not just a byproduct of evolution. It would mean that consciousness is woven into the very fabric of reality, perhaps even present at the smallest scales of nature. Whether All-Shore proves accurate or not, it pushes the boundaries of neuroscience and philosophy. And like many of the theories we'll explore, its value may lie as much in the questions it raises as in the answers it provides. Across time and culture, humans have tried to map the mystery of consciousness, not just its mechanisms, but its essence. In this final section, we turn to spiritual frameworks, Buddhism, Advaita Vedanta, and Gnosticism, that have contemplated consciousness not as a byproduct of matter, but as the root of reality itself. Buddhist thought views consciousness as both ephemeral and essential. The core idea is anatta, the doctrine of no self. According to this view, what we call the self is a convenient illusion, a bundle of processes, sensations, thoughts, emotions, perceptions that are constantly arising and passing away. There is no fixed entity at the center, just an impermanent flow. Consciousness in Buddhism is part of the 5 aggregates, skandhas, that comprise human experience. But it's not seen as a static thing. Instead, it arises in dependence on causes and conditions. When those conditions cease, so does that moment of consciousness. Yet, in some Buddhist traditions, especially in Mahayana and Vajrayana schools, there's the notion of Rigpa or Tathagatagarbha, an unconditioned awareness beneath all phenomena. This is not a personal self, but a pristine, non-dual clarity that transcends subject and object. Meditation is a way of directly experiencing this awareness, free from concepts or egoic distortion. Buddhism teaches that suffering arises from clinging to identity, to permanence, to separateness. By loosening this grip, through mindfulness and insight, one can realize that consciousness is not something we possess, but something we are, fluid, empty, and luminous. Advaita, a school of Hindu philosophy, means non-duality. It asserts that there is only one reality, Brahman, infinite consciousness, beyond name and form. What we perceive as separate selves, minds, or worlds are illusions caused by Maya, the cosmic illusion of multiplicity. The key teaching of Advaita is Tattvam Asi, thou art that. The individual self, Atman, is not different from Brahman. This isn't a metaphor, it's a direct claim. You are the universe, experiencing itself. From this view, consciousness is not produced by the brain, it is the ground of being. The mind and body are instruments through which Brahman plays. Just as the screen remains unchanged, regardless of the movie being projected, pure awareness underlies all experience. Self-realization in Advaita is the recognition of this non-dual truth. Through inquiry, who am I? Contemplation and guidance, one strips away layers of identification until what remains is silent, self-luminous consciousness. It is not a belief, but an experiential knowing that transforms perception. Gnosticism, an ancient spiritual tradition often associated with early Christianity, presents a radically different model. It posits that the world we live in is not the ultimate reality, but a distorted reflection created by a lesser being, the demiurge, who is ignorant of the true divine source. For Gnostics, the human soul contains a spark of the divine, a forgotten fragment of the transcendent realm. The purpose of life is to awaken to this truth, to gnosis, inner, direct knowledge of the divine, which liberates the soul from the illusion of the material world. Consciousness in Gnostic thought is the divine essence trapped in a false construct. The journey is not just one of understanding, but of remembering. Through insight, inner revelation, and radical questioning, The Gnostic seeks to break through the layers of deception and rediscover the original unity. While ancient, these models resonate with modern questions. Is consciousness local or universal? Is this reality all there is? Or are we dreaming a dream within a dream? The final and perhaps most audacious question we can ask is this: what is the ultimate relationship between consciousness and reality? Is consciousness simply one phenomenon within the grand machinery of the cosmos? Or is it the very ground from which the cosmos arises? In this chapter, we journey through some of the most radical interpretations of reality, from simulation theory and solipsism to philosophical idealism and the participatory universe. What if everything you've ever experienced, every sight, sound, touch, thought, is part of a simulation? Simulation theory suggests that our entire universe may be an artificial construct, a kind of hyper-advanced video game running on a computational substrate in a higher-level reality. This idea gained mainstream traction thanks to philosopher Nick Bostrom, who argued that at least one of the following must be true. 1. Humanity will never reach a level capable of simulating conscious beings. 2. If they do, they'll have no interest in doing so. Or 3. We are almost certainly living in a simulation. The argument rests on probability. If future civilizations create billions of simulations containing conscious minds, then statistically, we are more likely to be one of those simulations than the original biological beings. While simulation theory doesn't necessarily address consciousness itself, it reframes reality in a way that aligns with many ancient spiritual traditions, that the world is illusion, or Maya. In this view, consciousness may be the one real thing in an otherwise artificial world, a perceiver inside a sophisticated dream. But what is the nature of the simulator? Is it an alien intelligence, a future human civilization, or something entirely beyond comprehension? Simulation theory, while compelling, leaves these questions open, and perhaps that's the point. If simulation theory places consciousness inside a digital dream, solipsism pushes even further. It claims that you, your consciousness, may be the only thing that exists. Everything else, from other people to the cosmos itself, could be projections of your mind. It's a haunting and isolating idea, but it stems from an undeniable truth. Your only access to the world is through your own consciousness. You don't know that anyone else is conscious. You infer it. You don't directly experience the external world. You experience sensations, thoughts, and perceptions within your own awareness. Solipsism forces us to confront the limits of epistemology, how we know what we know. It doesn't claim that others aren't real, but that we can never be certain they are. Most philosophers reject solipsism, not because it can be disproven, but because it's unhelpful. It leads to a dead end. If you're the only thing that exists, then ethics, science, love, and meaning all collapse into abstraction. Yet, as a thought experiment, solipsism challenges the bedrock assumption that consciousness emerges within a shared, objective world. What if the opposite is true? That the world emerges within your consciousness? Idealism is the philosophical position that reality is fundamentally mental. Instead of matter giving rise to mind, it posits that mind gives rise to matter. Physical objects, space, and time are not primary. They're experiences within consciousness. Modern proponents like Bernardo Kastrup argue that all of reality consists of experiential states in a universal consciousness. What we call the physical world is the extrinsic appearance of mental activity. We are dissociated alters, individual perspectives within a broader mind. Similarly, cognitive scientist Donald Hoffman proposes that evolution has shaped us not to perceive objective reality, but a user interface. a simplified dashboard optimized for survival. According to his interface theory of perception, space, time, and objects are like icons on a screen, bearing no resemblance to the actual processes beneath. In this view, consciousness is not in the brain, it's the operating system of the universe. Brains, bodies, and worlds are virtual symbols rendered for our interface. We never perceive the real world, only what consciousness constructs for us. Idealism aligns with ancient views from Advaita Vedanta, Buddhism, and even Gnosticism, but it also opens new scientific frontiers. If consciousness is fundamental, then studying it may be the key to understanding reality itself. Physicist John Archibald Wheeler proposed a radical notion that we live in a participatory universe, that reality is not a fixed, objective structure, but something that co-emerges with consciousness. Quantum physics hints at this interplay. The observer effect in quantum mechanics shows that particles exist in states of probability until observed. Measurement collapses potential into actual. In other words, reality crystallizes through participation. Wheeler called this the it from bit hypothesis, that the universe is built not from stuff, but from information, and that information requires interaction, observation, interpretation, awareness. In this view, the universe is not a stage upon which we act. It's more like a symphony we help compose, note by note. We are not passive witnesses, but co-creators of reality. This doesn't mean we invent reality arbitrarily. It suggests that consciousness and cosmos are interwoven, that meaning, observation, and awareness are essential components of existence. Simulation, solipsism, idealism, and the participatory universe all offer radically different lenses through which to view reality. Each confronts the enigma of consciousness from a different angle, yet they share a common thread: the possibility that consciousness is not a side effect of the universe, but its source. Perhaps we are not tiny observers in a vast, indifferent cosmos. Perhaps we are apertures of awareness, peering into a reality shaped by our own depths. Perhaps the cosmos is not out there, but in here, dreaming itself through us. The final question, then, may not be, what is reality, but who or what is dreaming it? After traversing the vast terrain of consciousness, from the intricate machinery of the brain and the luminous tapestries of altered states to the dizzying heights of metaphysical speculation, we arrive not at a final, satisfying answer, but at something perhaps more valuable, a profound and enduring reverence for the mystery itself. Consciousness, the most intimate and immediate aspect of our being, remains paradoxically the most elusive, the most ungraspable. The closer we look, the more it slips between the fingers of comprehension. We have seen how science can measure the dance of neurons, construct elegant models of cognitive function, and map the contours of mental activity with dazzling precision. Yet for all this empirical rigor, it struggles, desperately, even helplessly, to explain why there is anything it feels like to be. Why should the physical patterns of a brain correspond to the smell of jasmine at dusk, the quiet ache of a broken heart, the elation of sudden insight? This is the infamous hard problem of consciousness, and it persists like a shadow at the heart of science's brightest achievements. It is not merely an intellectual puzzle. It is a riddle bound up with the very nature of existence. We have ventured into realms traditionally left to mystics and poets, near-death experiences that transcend clinical boundaries, the kaleidoscopic visions of psychedelic journeys, the silent expanses of meditative absorption, and the startling lucidity of dreams within dreams. Each of these phenomena offers a window, or perhaps a mirror, into forms of consciousness that defy our conventional understanding. They suggest that ordinary waking consciousness might be just one flavor among many, a single station on a vast and largely unexplored spectrum. These states challenge the assumption that our everyday reality is exhaustive or even primary, and then we turned our gaze outward and inward still to confront ideas that invert our most fundamental presumptions. Perhaps consciousness is not a mere epiphenomenon of matter, but rather the source from which the illusion of matter arises. From simulation theory to idealism to the participatory universe, these radical frameworks invite us to flip the lens entirely. What if the universe is not the stage upon which consciousness appears, but a drama being performed within the theatre of consciousness itself? With each breakthrough comes a deeper mystery. For every conceptual scaffolding we build, another level of wonder opens beyond it. This is not a failure of knowledge, but an invitation to humility, to awe, to a form of knowing that transcends certainty. The mystery does not shrink before our tools and theories. It grows more vibrant, more enigmatic, more alive. Across time and culture, mystics have whispered of a presence behind the eyes, a boundless awareness in which all phenomena arise and dissolve. Philosophers have wrestled with its paradoxes, and scientists have sliced into its mechanisms with methodical care. And yet none have laid final claim to the truth. There is wisdom, perhaps, in this restraint, for it may be that the question of consciousness is not one to be solved, but one to be lived. To study consciousness is not merely to analyze data or catalogue experiences. It is to enter into an intimate dialogue with the nature of being. It is to tread a delicate line between the objective and the ineffable, between reason and revelation. It is ultimately to undertake a sacred inquiry into what it means to be here, to be aware, to be. In the final reckoning, consciousness is not just another phenomenon in the universe. It is the condition for the appearance of any phenomenon at all. It is the hidden lens through which all knowledge, emotion, and sensation pass. We do not stand apart from it, examining it like some distant star. We are it. We are the observer and the observed, the question and the questioner, the echo and the source. So where does that leave us? With awe, with humility, with a deep, resounding sense of wonder that vibrates through every breath, every glance, every flicker of thought, and with a question, unanswered, perhaps unanswerable, but endlessly alive. What is this? There may never be a final, complete response, but perhaps that is not a flaw. It is the invitation. The journey into consciousness is not a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be danced with, a vast unfolding that mirrors the cosmos itself. It is the silent companion of every moment, asking not to be grasped, but to be met. The mystery endures, and so does the search.